Drew here, and I think that the best word to describe June Osborne in this week's episode of Handmaid's Tale, Testimony, I feel is ferocious. She's clearly decided that if she's not going back to Gilead to try and find Mayday and to take the war to them directly, then she's going to do everything in her power to fight them and to fight their malignant influence from within Canada's borders. And of course, the big event of this episode is June testifying before this panel against Fred Waterford and what he has done in the past to her and to other handmaids. And whatever happens to him, she hopes will be an indictment of the entire system, obviously. So the way this plays out, obviously we know everything that happened to June in the past. We saw her go through it. But I feel that actually hearing her state what happened to her and how she views it, I feel that it actually makes it easier to see how clearly wrong it was and how horrific, just to hear it in her own words. And it's a moment where June is forced to confront the reality of what happened to her, and Luke, who is present in the courtroom, who has been begging June this entire episode to let him know what happened to her, to let him try to understand the trauma. I feel that it's helpful for him to be there to hear this, to know what she went through and why it's so hard for her to move on. It's interesting. This episode, again, was directed by Elisabeth Moss, and I feel that it must be challenging to deliver a monologue and be directing the episode yourself. But she does a fantastic job, as always, and you can just see the simmering rage in her performance this episode as she talks about what happened to her. And it's interesting to me because you would think that this would be preaching to the choir, that what Fred Waterford and the people of Gilead, what the cult of Gilead have done is really wrong. But this episode, you see the defense attorney going after June and bringing up the things that oftentimes get brought up when people try to discredit women and their accusations, and, talking about the things that June has done in the past that, maybe not saying that she deserves it, but she didn't need to bring up the adultery to show that June was a deceitful woman. I feel that she brought up the adultery to paint June as some kind of a tramp, and also, of course, to show that she has lied in the past. So, of course, we can't take her word about what she says happened because she's done bad things. She's not perfect. So, therefore, we can have an excuse not to believe her. And on top of that, there is the justification of Fred himself, which the show, it's funny because everyone in the courtroom is like, oh, don't talk, keep your client in line, tell him to stop talking. But then he continues to talk, and then there's absolutely no repercussions for him whatsoever. And in fact, it seemingly seems to win the approval of some people in Canada. Some people are won over to Gilead's side by Fred's words, which is bizarre to me because what he said was crazy. But nonetheless, you do realize, I think it's easy for people to assume that everyone in the world is reasonable and thinks the same way that they do. But when you look around in the world, there's a lot of religions that many of you would deem oppressive religions that still win converts, and among the educated and among people that you would think would not be attracted to that. And we don't live in a world where there is this problem that this world that Margaret Atwood has created is experiencing, where there is a population problem, where the birth rate is so low. We live in a world where overpopulation is the problem. So you have to wonder how much that plays into people finding this type of argument from Fred more appealing. It might not be a logical argument, but it's something where when you're without hope, you might be willing to give yourself over to more willingly. I also thought it was interesting this episode seeing kind of the battle for Serena'S soul. I feel a lot of you probably think she's past the point of redemption, and maybe that is true. But it's interesting this episode, there are these glimmers of empathy in her as she's watching June testify, and as she's reminded of the horrors that she herself underwent as she had her finger lopped off for asking that women be allowed to read the Bible. And you see her kind of starting to wonder again, do I really want to support Fred? Am I really a part of this? And then as she sees that Fred's impassioned speech about what Gilead is trying to accomplish has won some people over to their cause, you see her being drawn back in, that she sees, oh, if I am a part of this, there is some power for me. And so as a power couple, Serena and Fred were more interesting this episode in some regards than they have been all season. I feel like it's been hard for the show to know what to do with them once they were on the outs. Otherwise, this episode, we see the survivors of Gilead grappling with how to deal with their trauma. And the debate this episode, obviously, we talked about it a lot in the comments last week. A lot of you don't like my take on this, but the conflict between June and Moira, who have different views of how the women should deal with their trauma. Obviously, this week we see Emily forced to confront this Martha that betrayed her and ultimately resulted in a woman getting hanged. And you see that June wants the women to dwell on their anger a bit longer. Perhaps her own confrontation with Fred and with her anger and pain and with her past experiences this episode is motivating her to try to help the other women to confront their own traumas and to admit the anger that they feel for what was done to them. But Moira, I think, has this concern that if they dwell on these negative emotions too long, that it's going to ultimately be harmful and it's going to inhibit them from finding healing, which of course June has that line about why is healing all that a woman can do. And obviously I'm on Moira's side in this debate, but I have to admit she came across pretty feebly this episode as she said that they were out of time, essentially like, oh, the bell rang, but June wasn't having it, and obviously the other women in the group are more interested apparently in expressing the anger and the feelings that they have about what happened to them than they are in, talking platitudes, I guess, to a certain extent. I feel that the relationship between Luke and June, it's in an interesting place right now. I feel like Luke is trying, but you see his impatience growing this episode as June refuses to let him in, as she doesn't open up to him about her experiences. And I feel like his impatience is understandable, even if it's a little bit unfair, because he has no idea the levels of trauma that June has gone through. But at the end of this episode, we see June finally deciding to tell Luke the truth. I think realizing that he needs to be able to confront the pain that Gilead has caused him in the same way that she has, and that sugarcoating it isn't doing him any favors. Otherwise, this episode, we had a brief return to Gilead to discover that Janine is alive and that she has been taken back and is once again under the authority of Aunt Lydia, who seemingly is struggling to return to normalcy. She vents her frustration on a fellow Martha this episode, as well as a hapless handmaiden. And in the teaser for next week, they show that Mrs. Keyes is also in the custody of Gilead, and that there's going to be interactions between Janine and Mrs. Keyes. And I have to wonder if this is like, they know that we need to see some of this show, some of this story take place in Gilead, so they're having these be the characters that will follow in Gilead. And I don't know if that means that June is going to exit the show at any point, or if it just means that for the time being that this is the perspective on Gilead we're going to get in the short term at the very least. But it was Not altogether surprising to see Janine again. I kind of thought that she had died at first, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized, no, if they didn't show us a body, then she's probably still alive and out there somewhere. So those are my thoughts on episode 7 of The Handmaid's Tale Season 4 Testimony. Let me know what you thought in the comments. If you're interested in seeing my upcoming reviews of other shows, please consider subscribing. As always, thanks for watching.